Let's have a talk, let's have a chat, talking about a little this and that. Hello and welcome to another episode of This and That. I am your host, Mary Easterling, and today we are going to do an episode for The Big Reveal 2 Under the Hood. It's called The Wrecking Cruise. I would put it on the River series, but it's not really River. You'll get an idea as we continue. When Bob did The Dredge, it was the beginning of July 2000, I believe. At any rate, this one is dated July 10, 2000. We're still looking at the imagery of that which is not of God. But before I begin to listen to anything more from This and That, The Big Reveal 2 Under the Hood, The Big Reveal, Veritas the Quest, go to talkingaboutthisandthat.wordpress.com and click on the podcast link. These items are from Bob Neumann. His work will be featured on our blog page. So the Wrecking Cruise will be on the blog page. Our blog page has read more links. Click on it. It'll take you to the article, which has the audio link, which opens in a separate tab, so you can listen while you look. We're talking still about that which is not of God, and there will be a very interesting image that comes to bear as you listen to this. So, The Wrecking Cruise, July 10, 2000. Bob writes, "This is the third image of four, all four different with few quote-unquote words, but many and deep images. The first two had little interaction with the master and with the quote-unquote other scene. The last two revolve as much around the characters as the images. This third vision began far differently. It started with a steam whistle in the background. It felt like I was waking from a quote-unquote nap. I was sitting on the ground leaning against a quote-unquote Alice pack / rucksack. A white plastic hard hat had been covering my face and had fallen down onto my chest. It seemed midday, and I stretched a little when someone gave a gentle nudge with a heavy work boot to my ribs. I looked up into the master's face and got up to my feet with the idea of quote-unquote break time was over." Let me interject here. If by now you don't understand this, the master is Jesus Christ. He is Lord, Savior and Lord. Lord in the Greek is actually master. And in the Hebrew, the concept of Rabboni was also seen as master. Bob writes, "I was standing on a nice grassy piece of land with a gentle slope. I quickly caught up with him as he neared the base of the hill, and I noticed we had, quote-unquote, stepped into a heavy shadow. I looked up to see what was causing the shadow and saw this massive building that gave me cold chills on my goosebumps. It was huge, and I noticed the wrongness of it immediately. I have seen the Sears Tower in Chicago many times. Its height and quote-unquote loftiness always left me impressed, but this left me with a deep sense of loathing. I seemed to stare up a long time wondering what was wrong with it and got nowhere. It took a single line from the master to return my attention to him. Quote-unquote, there is a job to do, was all he said as he walked toward the building. I came to what I took was the quote-unquote main entrance, with large ornate doors made of dark and heavy wood inlaid with stained glass. He handed me a large stencil, and I noticed I had a can of spray paint in my leg pocket. Never noticed I was wearing a heavy pair of work jeans with a tool belt and stuff. The master had a heavy chain and padlock with which he secured the doors. I placed the stencil against the door and sprayed the paint. It was bright red." I interject. Bright red. Does that tell you anything? Bob continues and said, "This property condemned by order of the king." He immediately made a right turn, went around the corner of the building. Once again, it had another quote-unquote main entrance, but modern smoke glass and steel. Again, he padlocked the doors, and I painted. And here I went from door to door, spraying the stenciled declaration and making sure all the doors were marked. Again, we turned a corner and had another door and another facade to the same building. That crazy building had one corner after another, one facade after another. Nothing, quote-unquote, four square here, I thought, as I scurried to keep up to the king, who seemed to be in a hurry on a time schedule. That is the quote-unquote feeling I had / discerned. But eventually we turned a last corner and came to what was the first door, chained and painted. I noticed heavy wires coming under the door. There were 3 sets of 7 wires that came out onto 3 large heavy spools with a heavy bar through their center holes. Without pause, without a word, he stooped down, picked up a bar on his side, and I copied his action. And we started to walk away from the building and up the hill where I had been, quote-unquote, resting. When we got to the place my Alice pack had waited, he stopped. Putting the spools down, he casually pulled out the rod of iron as if it were a broomstick and handed it to me. Turning over one spool, he sat down, cut the first set of 7 wires, handed me the wire cutters / strippers. With remarkable ease, I cut into the other 2 sets and sat down on the spool. I watched as he took out a control board of some kind, set it up in front of him. As I watched, I separated and stripped the insulation from the first wire. With a grim and determined look on his face, he attached the wire to the quote-unquote board. I guess that was when I first noticed the first quote-unquote set of voices. About halfway down the hill was a group of people following a man in an expensive suit. He was talking to a crowd, and every now and then the volume of his voice would increase and I would pick up a word or two. As I tried to listen, another group sort of arrived, and then another. I thought, this is quote-unquote getting interesting, when I heard a quiet quote-unquote, yo, dog. And I saw his hand outstretched, awaiting another wire. I mumbled sorry, and he looked me in the eye. It's okay, dog. It's almost over. And went back to the board. By this time, there were many groups, all with their own quote-unquote leaders. A few were close to where we were, and all sort of ignored us. Those that did notice had quote-unquote ugly looks for us, just sitting there. There were some real characters in this freely flowing mob scene. One was a guy with a gold-painted hard hat and a ball-peen hammer in hand. He slurred his words and kept shouting about tearing down the idols. There was a group of quote-unquote elderly women dressed in white robes / togas, flowers and leaves in their hair. They were barefoot and chanting something about, she shall overcome. I was puzzled when I heard the king say, the mother goddess Sophia dog full stop. The mother goddess, Earth Mother, Mother Earth, Gaia. Go to the Egyptians and you will find her. You will find Isis, I believe. Go to the Romans, go to the Greeks, and you will find the Mother Goddess and what she was doing to create the world. It's always the same thing. 2 gods getting jiggy with it and creating a planet. Not one very interesting being who simply speaks and creates the universe in which the planet is plunked, and then he works on the planet to make it habitable for his creation to inhabit. No, we're not going to be that simplistic. We're going to be very terrestrial about this. And this is where you get she who lays upon the ground and receives the attentions of he who is above, and they create the universe. It's a counterfeit, folks. All the other religions default to this. Do your homework. Go on YouTube. Go on Google. You can pay and you can get courses in some of these religions, ancient religions, and you'll find their creation mythos. It almost always involves some sort of sexual intercourse. There has to be 2 to do it. Well, there was 2 to do ours in the Christian quote-unquote mythos. The problem is the first one opened his mouth, uttered, and the second one came out and did the work. And along with it came his exhalation that's living in the Christian, the real called out one, born out of God one. Right. Okay. So the king says, the mother goddess Sophia, dog, Bob writes, and I turned back to him, realizing I had more wires to strip. He gave me a soft smile that warmed my spirit and pointed to the side. Here was a tag team of guy/gal in flowing, quote, ecclesiastical robes. They had pry bars in their hands. Beyond them was a group of people with long plastic, quote-unquote, horns, like you sometimes see at ball games. When the organist played the mandatory, quote-unquote, notes, and everyone yelled, "Charge!" We were down to the last few wires when the noise level suddenly escalated, and the guy with the gold hard hat charged the building. Like lemmings, they all went down and, quote-unquote, surrounded the building. They were groups with tambourines and banners, sledgehammers, and crowbars. It seemed our, quote-unquote, New Age matrons were carrying, smoking, something or other, and I thought of, quote-unquote, burning sage. What I got was a, quote-unquote, yup from the master, and watched as he took the last wire. Now, full stop. Burning sage, that's not just New Age. That's Wicca. That's white witchcraft. Can I ask you all, listeners, a question? All the rest of these people have the parody of church, Christianity church, going to go tear down the idols. What, pray tell, are they doing with the ladies in the togas with the flowers burning sage? And we know this to be New Age, white witchcraft, Wicca. I mean, don't just take it from me. Go and research it. Go Google it. In fact, burning sage is also, and I hate to say this, part of the Native American cult. It's how they honor the quote-unquote Great Spirit. All righty. Bob writes, just then I noticed one quote-unquote leader had broken the padlock and had pushed some of his people in. A different leader rushed for the door only to have it apparently locked from within. It was then that the absurdity hit me. All these quote-unquote religious types were going to tear down Babylon. So you wonder what the building was? Babylon. But in reality, they wanted in. I noticed that some of them made progress at making a hole or breaking a window. As often as not, someone tried to get into the building the king condemned. I looked back to my master, the king, sitting in common work clothes, watching me watch them. It was then that I noticed the quote-unquote shadow had now come up the hill, and we were sitting now in the shadow of this monstrosity of a building, a parody of his church. Let me say that again. A parody of his church, as in counterfeit. He reached behind him, picked up a bullhorn, tossed it to me. I stood up, pushed the on button, took a step forward towards the building, and all the wrecking crews feverishly doing what was right in their own eyes. I stooped down, picked up the rod of iron, leaned it on my left shoulder. I looked back at him, and he simply said, "Get it done, dog." I watched him look down at the control board. I faced the setting sun and the building, shouted through the bullhorn, "Fire in the hole!" And I saw the building shake, and everyone around the building stop and stare back at us. "Once more, dog," he said, and again I shouted, "Fire in the hole!" And again the building shook. But now, most of those assembled around the thing went back to their work. If anything, more feverishly than before. Now I turned back to him, and I could see tears running down his face, and I remembered the verse, quote-unquote, Jesus wept, full stop. Jesus wept is supposedly the shortest sentence in the Bible, but that was at the death of his friend Lazarus. Do you know another time when Jesus wept? It doesn't say Jesus wept. It says Jesus wept when he came to a certain place, and he said a certain thing. On the ascent to temple in Jerusalem, when he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stones the prophets, how often I would have gathered you under my wings as a hen does her chicks, but you would not have it." And he said it crying. Why? What happened 40 years after his ascension? Oh, 70 AD? Something about Rome, a burning temple. Oh, that was the end of our biblical Judaism and temple era. go back to Matthew 24, where the disciples said, what will be the sign of that end, of that age? And he warned them. Go back and read things like Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He was a historian. He makes mention that there was a Roman siege, that there was a response from the Jews. Think about Masada. Think about the Zealots. Think about the prophecies that were said about a city under siege, so bad that mothers would eat their afterbirth and their infants because there was nothing else to eat. They were starving. The infants were, by the way, being born dead because the mother's body couldn't support the birth and live at the same time. So they ate the stillborn babies. Yup. Bob writes. And I remembered the verse, Jesus wept, and I felt tears running down my face. He quietly said, again, fire in the hole! The echo continued unnaturally long. It seemed a few people actually stopped their actions and looked again toward us, but no one moved. I watched as with firm precision the Lamb of God flipped 3 groups of 7 switches. The first 7 explosions actually sounded like one longish one followed by 7 fast explosions, then 7 more. I watched as the whole quote-unquote thing sort of shimmered and began to fall in on itself. It was then the weirdness I sensed showed itself. The quote-unquote summit/top of the building was far wider/larger than the base. All her were around the building were covered with uncountable tons of debris. And I noticed the dust in the air. There was no wind or breeze, so it slowly settled straight down. I turned back to the king, and he had his back to me. In front of him stood a quote-unquote fence of white linen. It was the quote-unquote outer wall of the tabernacle. We came to the opening and looked to the space the tabernacle would be raised. I told you to get silver, he stated simply, and I stared into the inner court from the outer court. His last words were a repeat of an older image, one from Palm Sunday. So go paint your face and get the job done. That is where it ended. Selah Shmuel. All right, the explosion. It screamed for an interpretation, and I know precisely what this is. The wires. 3 sets of 7 wires. 3 sets of 7 wires. The control panel will have 3 sets of 7 hookups and a set of switches. 3 groups of 7 switches. Who's flipping them? The Lamb of God. We have 3 sets of 7 in the last book of the Bible. The first set are seals, an interminably long sound, like as if you had someone reading off a declaration, okay? Followed by the other 2 sets, 7 fast explosions, 7 more. The trumpets, the bowls, right there in this one piece, you have a vignette and a take of the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ. The people who are trying to tear down Babylon, get into Babylon, you have them around you right now. They're the same people that I have talked about in the Big Reveal 2, Under the Hood, the Apostate Church. Those of you that speak Creole, pardon me, but I believe it goes apostasy, the Apostate Church. It's not apostolic. It's apostate. It is not of God. Right now, we have a warning shot here in this nation about that church taking over the politics of the land where it is not supposed to, without actually openly saying that it's doing so. This is subtlety. If you're not watching the news, if you're not listening to the words that are coming out of people's mouths, the talking heads can lie, but if you're standing there with a camera rolling and the person you're interviewing is saying things, you ask a question, they give an answer, how are you going to doctor that? That's film footage, although we do have artificial intelligence nowadays. Still, that's libel and slander against the United States government if the press uses AI to doctor anything that's coming across from the government, from POTUS in the White House. Right. This is Babylon. Babylon is the Apostate Church. Always has been, always will be. They're one and the same. She, who was born out of Jerusalem of old, who became the harlot, who became destroyed, who became nothing, and she, out of which will rise, out of which will leave, exodus, depart from, those who are the actual sons who will be transformed on that day when the King reaps. They are the actual church. Everything else is the shell, the hull. Do you start to get it now? And that will do it for this episode of This and That. Until then,